Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second in NAAFA's 2020 webinar series. We're really happy to have you all here today. For those of you who are not aware of who we are, NAAFA is the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, and we are the premier fat rights organization with not only a national but an international reach, which you will be witnessing today. We are so excited to have Dina Amlund all the way from Denmark speaking with us today. Isn't this amazing technology that we can be here in Las Vegas or Phoenix or wherever you live in the world, Denmark, and we can all still share with one another. We're very excited to have Dina here today, and she's going to tell us, was it ever really okay to be fat? Without further ado, let me introduce Dina Amlund.
Thank you. So we have all grown up with fatphobia. Fatphobia has taught us that fatness is bad. And how can it be that the world hates fatness and fat people? Because it is a bearing structure in Western culture. We have these two contradictory narratives about fatness. So we have these two contradictory narratives about fatness that are repeated over and over again. We are constantly told that fatness didn't exist in the old days, that fatness is a new burden of society, and that we're also told that in the old days fat people did exist and that everyone loved fat people. So fatness is used in two different ways when we're talking about history, society, and evolvement. When we want to look back at a time, at a better time, then we see no fat people. We see fatness becomes a new phenomenon in a faulty culture. When we want to look back and see how far we have come, then we look back and we do see fatness. We see that it exists in a culture that celebrated fatness, and then fatness becomes an outdated phenomenon that has nothing to do in a modern culture. And I cannot count how many times that I have heard that in times when food was scarce and most people worked really hard in the field, being fat was the ideal way of having a body. It was a symbol of status for men and a symbol of beauty and fertility for women. I think I need to check in with Las Vegas and see if...
Hi, we're here. Can you hear me?
Yeah? Yes, I hear. I think I see you now also.
Okay.
So for years I have been digging out examples of fat phobia and the worshipping of thinness throughout Western history. Thinness with slightly different size variations, from very, very skinny to slender with a hint of softness, have always gained the claims of aesthetics, health, intelligence, morality, beauty, worthiness in the entire history of Western culture. No time period exception. So I want to go through history from ancient Greece till today, looking at cultural products, and I will dwell on the Baroque and Peter Paul Rubens, whose name is the origin of the term Rubenist. So we need to get the slides out, and first I will come with three disclaimers. One, I have a cold right now, so excuse me if I cough or sniffle or wipe my nose. during this webinar. And the second disclaimer is that I use the term Western, and I know that it is problematic and loaded, but I'm not sure what other term to use. I know that the term Eurocentric is good because Western culture is definitely Eurocentric, but Eurocentricity doesn't necessarily mean Western, so they are not synonymous, and I'm not sure that if I use that term, I cover the geographical area and the history correctly. So I may be wrong in doing so, but if I am, I hope you will excuse me. I also have very gender binary language because I'm talking about Western culture, and it's very difficult not to use gender binary language and talking about gender as if there are only two. So those are my disclaimers, and now I will go to the slideshow with you. Besides looking at paintings, I will be talking about fashion and shapewear. And while fashion is obviously something that caters to people of means, every layer of society has always been affected of what is in fashion at the moment. So depending on the definitions of Western culture or Western civilization, it begins in Greece. Some will say in Rome. There's a bit of a dispute there. Some will say a few hundred years BCE, and some will argue that it's much older than that. But I think that most people will agree that in this geographical area and in this time BCE, we can see development in culture in these areas, Greece, Crete, Malta, Rome, that we can call the beginning of Western culture, around 5,000 years ago, and culture being an umbrella term that encompasses social behavior and norms found in human society, and also knowledge, beliefs, arts, laws or rules, customs and habits of the individuals in these groups. So if we start with the Venus figurines, the fat Venus figurines, these three have been found in what we today call Czech Republic, Austria and Russia, and they are between 20 and 30,000 years old. So they do not belong to Western culture. We cannot claim them as Western because they are much too old for that. The youngest fat figurines that I know of are 8,000 years old, so they do not belong to Western culture either. They are older than that. And there have also been found Venus figurines that are slimmer, or some that are shaped in a way that we can't really tell if they're supposed to be fat or thin, but they don't get as much attention because it's more interesting with the fat ones. However, they don't belong to Western culture. So if we take the next slide, please. This is the body ideal that we see in Western culture. This is the statue is Venus de Milo, which is a Greek statue despite the Roman name, and it is dated between 130 and 100 years BCE. And the other photo is of a Roman sarcophagus, and that is dated around 200 CE. So this is a Western body ideal that we see through thousands of years of the Western history. So if we take the next slide, we will go a little bit back in time. This is the oldest shapewear that we know of in the West. This particular shapewear was found in what we call Crete today, and it is dated around 1600 years BCE. So it is pretty old, but we do have drawings of shapewear on pottery that date even further back in time. And you can also see that this is a very, very complex piece of shapewear that has not, it's not a one-off. This is something that has been experimented with for generations. So this idea of shaping the body goes way back. This particular piece was worn by the Minoan people. This is a drawing of what they found, and then they recreated it into a whole piece. And this is a shapewear for a woman, but they also made shapewear for men. Furthermore, it is believed that the Minoan people put form-fitting belts on their children to prevent growth in the waist area all through childhood. We also have references to shapewear in the literary work of Homer. We have jokes about fat bodies and worshipping of thinness and muscularity in various literature of ancient Greece and Rome, obviously later than this period with this particular piece of shapewear. But we definitely know that in this era, or these eras, however you define them, in this time, fatness was not welcome. So moving on up to the Middle Ages with the next slide. During the Middle Ages, which run from 500 to 1500, some will say it starts a little bit earlier than that, but from around 500 to 1500. During these three Middle Ages, being fat was very much not in fashion. Fatness was associated with the cardinal sins, gluttony and sloth. And even though shapewear was most likely forbidden in some places in Europe, or at least frowned upon during the early and perhaps also high Middle Ages, they would still use shapewear. They would just get around it by combining their undergarments and shapewear, so that it wasn't really shapewear, it was just undergarments, but it would still shape them because they would sew in brass wires and plaits made from wood or bone to tighten in the torso. The outer garments were looser, but you still weren't allowed to look fat. If you were a woman, you were allowed to look pregnant, but you had to look slender at the same time. During the Middle Ages, during the late Middle Ages, including the Gothic era, the clothes became tighter, especially women's clothing, and they developed a new system of buttons so that they could use leather vests to tighten in and flatten the torso, and they would also use bandages to slim and shape the body. Next slide, please. So from around 1200 CE, women's clothing became tighter, and both men and women would wear bandages underneath to tighten the body and make it smaller. It was also during this time that a growing number of religious women and nuns would make almost a career out of starving themselves. Anorexia mirabilis, or holy anorexia, became a phenomenon. Dr. Caroline Walker-Bingham, a leading scholar in the history of the holy anorexics of the Middle Ages, suggests that eating a lot, or even just eating, became synonymous with indulging in bodily and slothfulness pleasure, which were sinful. So the holy anorexics were worshipped like heroes for their food abstinence. Perhaps the most famous one was Saint Catherine of Siena, who we see in the painting with the crown of thorns and the stigmata on her hand. She lived from 1347 till 1380, And she was canonized only a few years after her death. She died from starvation at the age of 33, the same assumed age of Jesus when he died for humanity. Before her death, she had a vision of Jesus placing a ring on her finger. The thinner she was, the closer she was to him. The 14th century was also a century of severe periods of famine in Europe, including what is known as the Great Famine from 1315 to 1317. In this time, populations in Europe were cut down drastically. So if it's true, this narrative that we're always told that in times of scarcity, fatness becomes worshipped and thinness is not worshipped, then this would be it. But we see the exact opposite happening here. While anorexia mirabilis is absolutely associated with the high and late Middle Ages, it did continue up through time, and Catherine of Siena is still a popular saint. In this painting is from 1746, and you will also find YouTube videos of her with people talking about her today, because she's still very popular. And for good measure, I think I should also say she's not only popular for being thin, but also for playing a part in the Pope moving back to Italy after having stayed in France for a while. She wrote the moving letters. Apparently, I've not read them, but they're supposed to be of great literary quality. The other painting is of Jesus, and what is interesting about Jesus is that he is always depicted as everything that gives him status, and that is slender, muscular, white, blonde or light brown hair, able-bodied, beautiful, and here he is wearing high fashion of the Middle Ages. These garments are fit for a king, so they gave him as much status as they possibly could. And if it were true that fatness was seen as a status symbol, then Jesus would have been painted as fat. But we never see him as fat unless it's something modern where they want to make fun of Christianity, because fatness can always be used to ridicule something. But Jesus is always thin, just like he is in this painting. So next slide, please. The Renaissance runs from 1300, has an overlap with the Middle Ages, and runs from 1300 to 1600. And the Renaissance is a period that people will name drop at me when I say that it is not okay to be fat in any period of Western history. They say, oh, but the Renaissance, that period is full of the fat women, fat people. And then they will say often, Botticelli. So, of course, I have a Botticelli painting here in slides. This is the newborn Venus from 1484 to 1486. And as you can see, she's not fat. During the Renaissance, ancient Greece and its science, philosophy, and nudity got rediscovered. And nudity did not mean any kind of body positivity. It simply means the same thin ideal, the body as a machine, the Olympic ideal. We will later call it the fascist body ideal. And you just think of Da Vinci's famous drawing of the Vitruvius man, where he is placed in a circle and a square and has his arms out in perfect symmetry, perfect slenderness, perfect muscularity. It's the perfect ideal. They also developed new shapewear in the Renaissance. So next slide, please. This type of corset is made entirely of iron or steel. It was invented in the UK but became popular all over Europe. In the middle, we have Queen Elizabeth I, who was born in 1533, and she ruled from 1558 until her death in 1603. And she was wearing one of these corsets, and it has been written down how many people and how many hours it took to dress her. There are several descriptions of that. I don't remember it exactly, but it took a long time, much effort to dress her every day. And as she grew older and gained a little bit of weight, then it took even longer because she wanted to have the same waistline as always. The other queen in this slide is the French queen, originally an Italian noblewoman, Catherine of Medici, who was queen consort of France by marriage to King Henry II. And she was the queen consort from 1547 till 1559. And during this time of her ruling, fat waists were forbidden at the French court. So even if you had a very noble pedigree, you did not get inside court if you had a fat waist. So fat phobia trumped this very class-divided society. Next slide, please. This is a drawing from 1572, around that time. It's French, the 1500s, and what you see is a man who has leeches on his arms. Back then, they believed that body fat was liquid, like blood, and the leeches could suck out the blood if you needed that, and they could also suck out the fat. But what this proves is that already back then they saw fatness as a disease, or a disease-like state, or at least a problem to be fixed with the medical treatments they had. During this time, the late 1500s and also the early 1600s, a period where we go from the Renaissance to the Baroque era, is a very interesting time for several reasons, but also two of the biggest writers of all time lived back then. Shakespeare, who lived from 1564 to 1616, he wrote a lot of fat jokes. He used them as comic relief in his tragedies, and they took up a lot of space in his comedies also. And one of the characters who bring on these fat jokes is Falstaff, who was the fat character, and he was an audience favorite. So he was written into 4 tragedies and a comedy, The Merry Wives of Windsor. And one of the tragedies, King Henry IV, Falstaff has to deliver some sad news. It's a severe situation where good men are dying, and Falstaff says, "There live not 3 good men unhanged in England, and one of them is dead." So the problem is that not 3, that means 2, and one of them is fat, so only 1. There's only 1 good man left in England now, and it has to be told with a joke, and the joke is that it's funny because he's fat. So that is very much like watching a Hollywood film today, where they will also make that type of joke. Nothing much has changed there. Another writer of this time is Cervantes, who lived from 1547 till 1616, the same year that Shakespeare died. He wrote the first novel ever published, Don Quixote. The first volume was published in 1605, the second in 1615. And the very structure of the novel is fatphobia. Don Quixote has lost his mind, and he's on a quest to fight windmills and so on. And who does he travel with? A fat man who is also disgusting and gullible. And together they can go on this quest. And it takes a man who lost his mind to want to travel with a fat man, and it takes a fat man to want to travel with a man who lost his mind. And Don Quixote is, the entire novel is this satire over the poetry about chivalry and damsels and all that. And how does he do this satire? By having a fat man. That always makes it more funny. So moving on up to the Baroque age, and the next slide. Thank you. This is Peter Paul Rubens, whose name is the origin of the term Rubenist. This is one of his favorite motifs. This is Prince Paris. He is holding out an apple, and he is to give this apple to the most desirable of the three most desirable goddesses, Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera. And it is Aphrodite in the middle who is being crowned, and he is holding out the apple to her. And when Rubens paints the most desirable goddesses we can think of, he chooses these three models because this is the ideal. They might look slightly softer, perhaps, than models today, or Botticelli's Newborn Venus, but they're definitely not fat. Let's take the next slide. This is also Peter Paul Rubens, and it's the same motif. It is Prince Paris handing the apple to Aphrodite, who's in the middle, being crowned. And again, they are not fat. We have been told that they are fat, so maybe it needs a bit of adjustment when you look at the painting, but really they are not fat. And the next slide, please. This is the same motif, also Peter Paul Rubens. This is Prince Paris and the three beautiful goddesses. So we can see here that perhaps Hera has a slight more soft tummy than we would see in many paintings, and of course that does mean that it didn't hurt their eyes to look at this, but she's still not fat. And also very, very important for this particular painting is that we don't see Prince Paris handing the apple, we don't see Aphrodite being crowned, but we do have to know that it is Aphrodite in the middle, and Rubens tells us this by Aphrodite being the thinnest and the whitest of them all. So slenderness is definitely in fashion in the Baroque era. Perhaps tiny bit softer than the centuries before and the centuries to follow, but still they are not fat. So next slide, please. So here we have some men examples. The first painting, Jesus, is the raising of the cross, the elevation of the cross. It's part of an altarpiece, and we see Jesus, and he is the whitest and the thinnest of everyone in the crowd. And it's important to know when we're talking about beauty and beauty ideal in this time, because here in the 1600s and every century before that, women were not yet the fairer sex. The fairer sex doesn't happen until the 1700s. So in this time, women are just the weaker sex, and men are beautiful. Mankind is the most beautiful of all God's creation. Men are the most beautiful of all mankind, and Jesus is the most beautiful of all men because he is both God and man. And here he is, being thinner and whiter than the others, and you can see how beautiful he is. The other painting is also Peter Paul Rubens. It's Bacchus. It's from 1640. It's Bacchus is the Roman god of wine and intoxication, and you can see that he's painted as a fat person. So that is obviously interesting. However, we need to know even more about Rubens and the gender binary style he had. He had two ways of painting people. One to paint women and children, and one to paint men. And it has to do with choice of colors, and some art historians say that the line is more finished when painting men. So Bacchus is painted like a woman. And so this is not a painting of an ideal man. It's quite the opposite. It's somehow degrading him. I've seen art historians describe Bacchus here as equally majestic and repulsive, which is very fatphobic. But I think that is very much how Rubens would think himself. So the next slide, still in the 1600s. This is 1642. This is a portrait by Bartholomeus van der Helst. The sitter is Gerard Bicker. He was the son of the mayor of Amsterdam, and this painting hangs in Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and it's very interesting how the audio guide treats this portrait. The first half of the audio guide is a neutral voice that is supposed to be describing the portrait very neutrally, objectively, and it says that Gerard Bicker has a gaze that is full of confidence, and then it talks about how beautifully painted it is, and that these were expensive clothes with the lace and the gloves, and then the voice also says that he was probably spoiled, which could be about the expensive clothes, but I'm guessing it's also about him being fat. The second half of the audio guide is quite interesting, and that's why I'm going to play it to you, if iTunes will let me, because it's a little bit looks different today for some reason. So here we go.
The most typical about Gerard, and that's not typical for the rest of his generation, is that he was so big. Most likely he suffered from obesity, which was also a sickness in the 17th century. There are rumors from his contemporaries that he weighed 450 pounds. Behind his back they called him a fatso. This obesity was a sickness that he probably inherited from his mother, who was also quite large. And if we look really close at his face is almost perfect. You might even think that he's...
And then he talks about makeup, and that's fine. But let's dwell a bit on what he says about Gerard. He talks about how fat he is and how that sets him apart, but then he also talks about obesity being a sickness, like he wants to say obesity epidemic almost, and he also says that Herat got his fatness from his mother, who was also fat. So again, with the double narrative of fatness not really existing and being something very strange with this young man, and then also being a sickness and mentioning other people being fat. But even more interestingly is that it is simply recorded in the history journals that he is being bullied. They call him fatso. They guess how much he weighs. Even though he's the son of the mayor and the son of a wealthy man, he doesn't escape being bullied for being fat. And why would they bully him if fatness wasn't the opposite of ideal? They don't bully him for being rich. They don't bully him for being white. They bully him for being fat, which means fatness was very much not ideal in the Baroque era, which is absolutely associated with fat people in painting. Just because we have portraits over the various eras of Western history of fat people doesn't mean it was ideal. It just means that fat people existed. And fat people have always existed. So, going to the next period with the next slide, please. This is the 1700s, and this is the so-called years of Enlightenment, very problematic term. These two paintings are of the two most influential and most beautiful women at the French court. The first one is Madame de Pompadour, who lived from 1721 to 1764, and the other one, obviously, Marie Antoinette, who was born in 1755 and beheaded in 1793. So the 1700s is associated with science. This was a time when humans were being put into these hierarchies in the name of science. We already had the hierarchies where some people were worthy and some people were not. But during this period with science, it was used to place people in these very specific hierarchies to excuse all sorts of monstrosity, like buying and selling people and stealing other people's countries, etc. So this is a really good book when talking about this period of time and the time to follow. This book is called Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fatphobia. It is written by Dr. Sabrina Strings, and it came out on New York University Press last year. She mapped out very thoroughly how racism and fatphobia are extremely closely linked in this science that takes place. Fatness, skin color, gluttonous appetite for food or sex, lack of morality, lack of ethics, these all become arguments that support each other and that can be used almost interchangeably in these arguments for placing humans in these very detailed hierarchies. So I'm going to read a little bit from it, because in the towards the end of the 1700s, there is a French anthropologist and naturalist who combined two already existing scientific theories about black bile. Since ancient Greece, there has been this idea that there are four bodily fluids that must be in balance for a person to be good looking and intelligent and worthy in every way. And and those four bodily fluids are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And there was this theory that an excess of black bile caused dark skin. And there was also a theory that an excess of black bile caused body fat. And so these two already existing theories were simply combined by this Julien Joseph-Viry in the 1700s. And it becomes this narrative that black people are fat and white people are thin. And it may sound really strange, but when we think about what other things have been said about black people or about white people in the name of science, it's not even that strange. But he supported his bile theory with this cranium theory. And trigger warning, because it's extremely racist and extremely fatphobic. In our white species, the forehead is projecting and the mouth retreating, as if we were rather designed to think than to eat. In the N-word species, the forehead is retreating and the mouth projecting, as if you were made to eat rather than to think. He also has lots of theories about how body fat reacts to being in warm countries under the sun. He has a lot of ideas. But the point is that him and other racist, fatphobic men who get to do science and develop science, they create this narrative that white people are thin and black people are fat. And this is the science that all science in the future builds on. And that's why it's very difficult to take out these things from our culture. But I will get back to Sabrina Strings and this book a little later on. First, the 1800s, with the next slide. So here we have British fashion. Fatphobic and racist science continues, and in the 1800s, white people are developed into more racial categories than just one, and that has very much to do with thinness and fatness. And the Anglo-Saxon is said to be the most superior of the white races, and that has probably to do with the UK being the most influential country at this time. And many diets are developed in the 1800s. In the 1700s, it seemed that drinking milk and eating nothing was the idea of how to diet. But then in the 1800s, several other ideas are being developed. In 1863, William Banting writes about this, and his name, Banting, almost becomes synonymous with dieting. But it really explodes with the dieting, with diet culture. Next slide, please. So this is fatphobic satire from 1806. These are two politicians, the two greatest men in England. It's not about their politics, it's not about their work, it's not about their personalities, it's not about anything other than that they are fat, and it's funny because they are fat. That is simply the joke. Next slide, please. So the 20th century, here is an ad from a Chicago newspaper in 1933, which is only 4 years after the big stock crash. And this is a time where people were desperately poor. Some people were dying of starvation in the streets. Some people put their children up for sale. This was terrible, desperate times. This is yet another time where, if this was a natural law that happened, that every time scarcity, every time there's scarcity, then fatness becomes ideal. Then this would also be one of these times, but it was not, and it wasn't in the 20s with the flapper girl, and it wasn't in the 10s or the aughts. It wasn't in any period. But let's get back to Sabrina Strings, who has read a lot of Journal of American Medical Association, which was and is a very renowned medical journal. Here at this time, this is 1924, there is still this strange combination of fatness and race, and now also disease, just like we still see today with fatness and disease being linked in a way that's extremely difficult to separate the two. But here we have, in 1924, someone named Dr. Elliot Jocelyn, who writes this, and again, trigger warning, this is extremely anti-Semitic and extremely fatphobic. He writes in 1924, "The Jew, in my opinion, is not prone to diabetes because he is a Jew, but rather because he is fat. Jews are fat." And in 1921, he writes, also in JAMA, in Journal of American Medical Association, he writes, "One has only to visit the Jewish quarter of a large city to be impressed with the frequency of obesity." So, it's pretty extreme. The last slide I have included is from the 1950s, because for some reason the 1950s are often talked about as a particularly curvy decade. So I've taken some of the queens from the 1950s, Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, and Betty Page, and they are not fat in any way. I remember that John Irving, in A Prayer for O'Neill, his novel, he compares Marilyn Monroe to the U.S., and he says something like, overweight but beautiful, or something. And I've come across that statement once in a while, that Marilyn Monroe is fat somehow, but she really wasn't. I could have taken photos from any decade from the 20th century, and we would see slenderness being ideal. So yeah, there is absolutely no proof to this myth that is constantly being repeated, that in the old days they liked fat people. In the old days, they somehow, because they were, either because they didn't know any better, they liked fatness, or sometimes in a more romanticizing way, there is this idea that before the world went astray, there is more diversity, there's more space for fat people. No. I would say, looking back at history, I would prefer being fat today to any other period of time. So yeah, I think my voice wants me to stop talking soon, so I'm going to drink some more tea, and if you have any questions, please bring them.
Thank you so much, Dina. This has really been enlightening. I know that I have often looked at Ruben's pictures and thought, well, those women don't look very fat to me. It's so nice to know that you agree. Thank you for pushing yourself beyond your limits. Hope your cold gets a lot better. Questions, anyone? Well, it looks like no one has any questions. You covered everything so thoroughly. We're all sitting here going, wow. Again, thank you so much for taking this time to be with us. We know that your time is different than ours. Hope we didn't keep you up too late or get you up too early.
Oh, no.
We appreciate all of you who have attended, and we hope that you watch for our announcements of the next webinar and join us when you can. Keep in mind that these webinars are recorded and they are stored on our website at NAAFA.org. Look under conferences, and conferences tab will take you to another tab that says webinars. So we are also loading webinars onto our YouTube channel, slowly but surely, as we give them, so you might be able to find them there as well. Thank you one and all, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you again, Dina. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for letting me be part of this.
We appreciate you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.